In yesterday's video, we talked about the top 3 stars most likely to be traded based on a recent article in The Athletic. Today, we're going to continue looking at that article and take another look here at another group of players that a lot of the NHL scouts feel are most likely to be traded. We'll discuss those players coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, today we're going to take another look at the article that we looked at yesterday from The Athletic, written by Craig Custance, where he surveyed 21 of the top NHL agents for a random amount of questions here around trades and playoffs and a whole bunch of different things that he posed to them. And one of the questions was, which top stars do you feel are most likely to be traded? They compiled the top 10 list of the players who get the most votes. Yesterday we looked at the top 3, who was far and away the most votes out of the 21 votes that were given. And then today we're going to take a look at the remaining 7 spots. It's actually going to be 8 players because there is a tie in the last spot here. So we're looking at spots 4 down through 10. So let's take a look at those players that the scouts feel like are likely to be traded sometime in the next 12 months. And I'll give you my thoughts and opinions on those players, and I want you to do the same down in the comment section and see what your thoughts are on these players. Now, outside of the top 3 we looked at yesterday, the next player who got the most attention and the votes was William Nylander of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, yesterday we looked at Mitch Marner, who had, I believe, was just one more vote than Nylander. Many of the scouts felt that the Leafs were going to be a team to make a significant trade if they do not see significant playoff success this season. Obviously, we know that they're giving the Big Four another shot this year. They did not make any big trades that way, but they have adjusted their blue line, made other changes. We'll see how much success the Leafs have this year, but I do think it's fair to say that if they do not have significant playoff success, and I'm meaning like at least a couple of rounds of victory, if not a deep run for sure, then I do think the odds are high that we're going to see one of their top players be traded out and do a significant shakeup. And Marner and Nylander are the most likely players to do that. Based on their contracts and their value, they're young, they're very productive players, very talented, very skilled. I think that they would be the most likely. Now, William Nylander went through a slew of trade rumors before when he sat out for part of the season unsigned. Of course, he came back. He struggled to get a lot of grief from Leaf fans, but last year I thought he bounced back quite nicely, and now that contract's looking pretty good. Could turn out to be a bargain contract if he continues playing at the level that he did last year, if not even higher level, because I think it's possible that he has not fully peaked yet. He's still young enough that I think we could still see some more room for development before he kind of peaks at his top performance here. So William Nylander is another guy, and I must say I do agree with this analogy. I don't think Nylander and Marner both would end up being traded, but I do think one of the two, if we don't see significant Leaf success this year, could very well face the chopping block, and it could bring back a significant return for the Leafs to really shake things up and address other areas of the team. Now, next up on this list is a pair of players from the Vegas Golden Knights, and that's Max Pacioretty and Marc-Andre Fleury, who both have an equal number of votes here as well. Now, of course, the Vegas Golden Knights could still pull this off sometime soon, but I think Fleury will stick around for the upcoming season. Whether or not he survives a whole year or into next offseason and beyond, difficult to say, and I think the odds of that are probably pretty low. I think the odds of seeing a Fleury trade before his contract is up at least is still pretty solid. He still has a couple years left at $7 million. His play has kind of declined a bit in the last couple of years. And Vegas is tight up against the cap, severely tight. They just signed Robin Leonard to a big extension, and they're going to keep Fleury for at least another season here. So, after all the comments that have been made and how everything kind of got played out between Fleury's agent making a big deal on social media, with the sword going through him, being stabbed in the back by Peter DeBoer, etc., I don't think we're going to see a Fleury trade real soon, but within the next year, certainly possible. If not by the NHL trade deadline, then by next offseason would not be surprising at all. But I think Pacioretty, out of the two, would be the one that's more likely to go sooner rather than later. They need to do something reasonably significant, because they do need to find some cap space here to be compliant before the season starts. There was a lot of rumors around Max Pacioretty before earlier in the offseason around the NHL draft. There was talk that they were super close to trading Pacioretty at that time. There was a few teams that were pretty close to pulling the trigger on a Pacioretty trade, and it never quite came to be. So I think he's a player making, again, a significant amount of money, hasn't quite lived up to that contract, has tailed off a bit, but still a very good, productive player. I thought he had a really good playoff for Vegas this past season. They had a deep run again, and Pacioretty was a big part of that. So I still think he has a lot to offer, and teams see that. They don't have a ton of term left, and I think for the right deal, it would make a lot of sense for Vegas to consider it. It brings out a significant amount of salary, helps with their overall cap space. They could get some futures, and Pacioretty could go on and be, a nice piece on another team that's in a similar situation, obviously. But Vegas has to be careful here. They don't want to help too many of their rivals in the Western Conference, especially, get better as they want to continue to fight for that elusive Stanley Cup here as well. But would Vegas Golden Knights make sense to move one of these players in the next 12 months? I think it's reasonably possible, possibly even both. But if I had to pick one, I think a Max Pacioretty trade is more likely at this point. Now, another player who was in on this list is James Van Riemsdyk of the Philadelphia Flyers. Now, I can understand from a Flyers perspective why they'd be interested in moving him. I just think it's going to be difficult to do. James Van Riemsdyk is good around the net, can be a decent goal scorer, can be okay in the power play. Not the quickest, doesn't have the greatest foot speed, and considering what he's making for money, I think that's going to be a difficult contract to consider doing now. I mean, if they look at what they paid him, thankfully they didn't give him too much term, but he still has a number of years left. And there's he was a player who popped up on the TSN trade bait board around the trade deadline. I know Frank Cervelli, TSN, went on a numerous amount of times about how he felt the Flyers were trying to trade Van Riemsdyk. So I understand from the scouts' perspective that were surveyed why they feel it's likely and that his name has certainly been out there. But I'm not convinced that they're going to be able to pull it off. Depending on what they do, I mean, there's only a few teams I think that could take on that kind of money. And obviously would want probably something extra involved to do so. So it depends on what Philadelphia wants to ante up the offer here. But I think it's going to be a difficult one to do, but certainly interest from the Flyers' perspective to move on from JVR if possible. Now, another defenseman on this list that's making a decent amount of money, and certainly I can understand why he's on this list, is Ryan McDonagh of the Tampa Bay Lightning. The Lightning are another team desperate for cap space. We've talked about them a lot this offseason, and Julien Brisebois is going to have to do some magic tricks here to get cap compliant as well if he wants to have his RFAs in the lineup at the start of the year. We saw them take a good amount of time to get Braden Point signed last year. It was a little bit late getting into camp, and they started the season and all that, so he missed a little bit of time, but still got a great contract, a great 3-year deal. Got worked out, but it took a long time to negotiate and get it hammered out, and now we have 3 guys in that boat, and they're all pretty important, especially Cirelli and Sergachev, who play relatively big roles given their young age and the fact that they're just coming out of their entry-level contracts. So obviously McDonagh's a player with a ton of experience, and even though he plays a big role, you could argue that Tampa is such a deep team that he is a player that could come out. Now, I'm surprised in a way that he is the only player from the Lightning on this list, because obviously there's been a lot more talk about guys like Tyler Johnson, Yanni Gourde, Alex Killorn as being the primary guys to come out of the forward group. Obviously, they already lost a little bit on the blue line through free agency that they were not able to re-sign. Kevin Shattenkirk's prime example of that, who went to Tampa, got revitalized, and then moved on after winning the Stanley Cup. Same with Zach Bogosian. And so obviously those guys are no longer in the Lightning organization, but they're a deep team. If they want to keep Sergachev, it might mean another veteran has to go. So I kind of understand there, but again, they've given up so many no-trade clauses that, again, this is going to be difficult to do. And I can understand that there probably would be interest in McDonagh from around the league. He's a solid leader, good defender, lots of experience. Contract's not terrible, but at the same time, he's got a lot of control in this situation, which does make things complicated. Same thing with a lot of the forwards that we've talked about before. So as much as I can see him being on this list, I would be a little bit surprised if he is indeed traded in the next 12 months. Now, it also has Zach Werenski of the Columbus Blue Jackets, and this one I found a little bit surprising. Now, obviously, we know that the Jackets are a team that needs to add some offense, and they're going to be in a predicament here in the next year or two when Jones and Werenski both need extensions, that keeping them both might be challenging, but they're right now, at least in a situation with their cap space, that it should be possible, and I think the intention of Jarmo Kekalainen will be to sign both of those guys long-term and to build out from the blue line out here. Have them be the 2 cornerstones of the franchise on the back end and really eat up a lot of the minutes back there. I think that's the plan for Kekalainen, so I personally don't see a Zach Werenski trade being very likely. I guess you never know if a trade offer comes along that knocks their socks off and gets them like a top-notch winger, then maybe. Like, for example, when we talked about Patrick Laine before, Columbus has been a team that's been linked to being interested in his services, which makes a lot of sense. They need a top-scoring winger. He's exactly that. Can you imagine him playing with a guy like Pierre-Luc Dubois for the next 5-10 years? That makes for a very interesting situation. It certainly sounds quite appealing if you're a Jackets fan or Jackets management. But as I've mentioned on numerous occasions before, if Columbus is going to be acquiring Laine, one of the top pieces that they're going to be asking for would exactly be Zach Werenski. I think they'd want Werenski over Jones, to be honest, and I just don't see Columbus wanting to do that. So that would be the only kind of trade where I could see that making sense and possibly happening. I think the odds of it are slim. So I personally think Werenski likely signs a long-term deal and stays with the Jackets myself. Now, next up, we have goaltender Jonathan Quick, who still has 3 years left with the Kings at a cap hit of $5.8 million. But this contract's going to get more and more reasonable and likely to be moved as the years go by here for a couple of reasons. One, we don't have the trade protection in there, so they can move him at their free will without getting his consent. So that helps a lot. And it's a backdiving contract, so each year the actual cash going out is going down. Obviously, the cap hit remains at 5.8. But it goes from like 3.5 down to 3 down to 2, I believe. So like it's a declining value each year. So if a team certainly wants to acquire him, they can take the cap hit, but they want to have somebody who they can, not have to pay a ton of money to, like in physical cash. He is exactly that kind of player. So I think from the Kings' perspective, they're not expected to be real good just quite yet. I think a lot of their kids need time to develop. But they have one heck of a prospect pool. They can only continue to get better year after year. They have some younger goalie prospects in the system. If they wanted to move on from Quick and let somebody else like Cal Peterson, for example, kind of take over the reins as a starting goaltender, then there's certainly that opportunity to do that. And I think this contract would be relatively easy to do. I'm not sure it's going to be real soon that we see a Jonathan Quick trade, but where this article is based on the next 12 months, especially when we get to next offseason, there's 2 years left with not a ton of money left. I certainly see it being quite possible if you look at the teams, especially that have that lower cap space right now, like New Jersey and Detroit, Ottawa. The teams like that would be the most likely to make a consideration to have the extra space available for that kind of deal. And last but certainly not least here, we have the 2 top guys from the Chicago Blackhawks, each getting an equal number of votes here to be a tie for 10th spot, and that's Patrick Kane and Jonathan Toews. Now, certainly some of the comments from the scouts that were surveyed here indicate they don't feel it makes sense for the Hawks to keep around 4 solid veteran guys making a ton of money while they're trying to rebuild. They didn't feel it made sense either for the players so they can go to another franchise, still contribute at a high level, and possibly win more Stanley Cups, and to them that made a lot of sense. But for some players and for some teams, they have that, that connection, that loyalty that they do not want to move on. They want to be a lifelong member of one particular franchise. And that very well could end up being the case with these 2 guys, with Toews and Kane. Wouldn't be surprised if they had statues outside of the United Center someday. They certainly brought a lot of glory to this franchise. A lot of winning took place during their era. And as they go through this rebuild, they could be great leaders and great mentors for the guys coming in. There's no doubt they can still play at a good level. There's no doubt about that either. We saw that this past year in the playoffs. So I do think if the Hawks decided that they wanted to approach them about a trade, or these guys decided they would want to try playing for another team, there's a ton of value there, and I think Chicago could get a pretty good return. Obviously, they have fairly hefty salary, though, which does complicate things at over $10 million apiece, but there's not a lot of term left, and as we approach the end of this, I can at least see why the scouts feel it makes sense. I'm just not sure how likely it's going to be. I mean, I know we've talked a couple times about a couple of Patrick Kane trade scenarios, but really, it's tough to say they give up a lot of youth when you're bringing in a guy. As much as he's still a dynamic player, he's not super young. And unless you're that team that's like one missing piece to put them over the top, to me, it just doesn't make sense to give up a lot of your future for an aging star, even though they're still playing at a high level. It's tough to say. It's just I'm not sure how likely that kind of deal would be. So let me know what your thoughts are on these players down in the comments. What is the likelihood that the players we talked about today are traded in the next 12 months? NHL scouts, they feel they're the most likely star players to be moved, and I want to know what you think as well, so let me know down in the comments. We'll discuss further. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content. And give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.